Hello everyone, I'll begin the introduction properly. My name's Martin Hurcombe and welcome to Writing the Ride. This round table, this discussion came out of a conference that was planned to be held at the University of Bristol just before COVID, in fact days before we went into lockdown, and unfortunately was cancelled. And the original plan was to have a round table discussion talking about the relationship between writing and sport generally. But I think over the last few months, I've had various conversations with Isabel Best and Paul and Marlon and Ian about cycling. And I think the focus on cycling through lockdown, just the sheer presence of cyclists on the roads, but particularly during the first phase of lockdown, has actually given us a bit more of a sharper focus. And so I wanted to have a discussion around cycling in particular and the relationship between cycling and writing. So the conference, as I said, was originally planned by the University of Bristol, and tonight's event is supported by the University of Bristol, and I'd like to thank them, but also by the Institute for Modern Languages Research, which is based at the University of London. As I said, my name is Martin Hurcombe. I have a research interest in cycling. My relationship with cycling is rather accidental as well as slightly accident prone. I won a bike in a competition about 10 years ago after I bought a bottle of Gatorade after a swim, which frankly didn't really deserve any kind of energy drink. And that got me back onto a bike after a 20-year break. My interest in cycling literature and cycling writing also stems from the fact that I bought a book in a bargain bucket in a bookshop in France about 6-7 years ago, which is the story of one cycling journalist, Jean-Manuel Ducoin, and his experience, his memoirs of the 1985 Tour de France, which was the last one to be won by a Frenchman, Bernard Hinault. And it was really, the whole book was just a pretext to talk about his nostalgia, his relationship with his grandfather, and his memories of a kind of working class French existence, which he claims had been swept away by deindustrialization and so on and so forth. So it got me interested in the ways that people actually quite often use cycling as a pretext for talking about other things, for bigger themes and so on and so forth. And I'm pleased to say that rather than talk about my research tonight, we have what I'll call 4 proper cyclists and 4 proper writers who are going to talk about their work. I'm just going to introduce them very briefly. Has Isabel managed to join us yet? No. Well, Isabel Best hopefully will be coming along any minute now. So I'll say more about her when she joins us. I'll start by introducing Paul Jones. Paul describes himself, give us away, Paul, yes, thank you, describes himself as an occasional racing cyclist who struggles to balance the demands of writing about cycling with doing some actual cycling. He once appeared in the same race as Sir Bradley Wiggins, Geraint Thomas and David Miller and scraped a 49-minute 25. He has an obsession with time, social change and people, both on and off the bike, and this is reflected in his 3 books. His first book, A Corinthian Endeavour, explored the niche and deranged world of the hill climb and is seen as the definitive and only work on the subject. The follow-up, I Like Alf, 14 Lessons from the Life of Alf Engers, is a biography of mythical folk hero Alf Engers and an exploration of the early morning antics of British time trialling. His new book, End to End, A Tale of Obsession, Hallucination and Happiness, will be published in April 2021 and tells of Paul's encounters with those who have attempted another British cycling obsession, belting up the country from one end to the other as fast as humanly possible. Marlon Moncrieffe, Marlon, if you want to give us a wave as well. There he is. Marlon Moncrieffe is a former racing cyclist. Between 1994 and 2000, he mostly raced road time trials and road races in the southeast of England. On the track from 2007, he was a pure sprinter, racing across the country in National Sprinters League and international events against some of the fastest riders and up-and-coming juniors. He won the 2010 UCI World Championships Track Sprint Masters Silver representing Great Britain and has enjoyed multiple successes at the UEC European Championships, British Cycling and Divisional Championships. He is an interdisciplinary researcher, writing and sharing education about British cycling culture. After absorbing the nostalgic and celebratory discourses of empire and imperialism in the representation of British cycling around the 2012 Olympics, he was inspired to launch the project Made in Britain, Uncovering the Life Histories of Black British Champions in Cycling. And his book, Desire, Discrimination, Determination, Black Champions in Cycling, is due for publication in spring 2021. Ian Walker, Ian gives a wave. There he is, has been cycling since he read a book by Josie Dew while at university. Cycling as a form of transport became a big part of his professional life in the early 2000s when he started researching cyclist safety and then later working on why people do or don't choose to travel by bike. Cycling as sport is a much more recent interest for Ian. In 2017, he began competing in ultra-distance cycling races and has since taken part in 3 major pan-European bicycle events: the Transcontinental Race, the North Cape 4000, and an attempt on the Guinness World Record for the fastest bicycle ride between Europe's northernmost and southernmost points. These journeys are the core of his recent book, Endless Perfect Circles, where he explores endurance sport in part from a psychological perspective, reflecting on how ordinary people can develop and grow through the process of fast, long-distance riding. Isabel hasn't joined us yet, as far as I can see, so I'll do her introduction when she gets here. And we're going to start with Paul. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go around each of our guests. If I could ask you, those of you, anybody but Paul, if you could just make sure you're muted and that your video is off. That way and that you've got speaker view on, then you'll be able to see Paul rather than anybody else at the moment. So I'll start with Paul. And Paul, is it fair to say that your books focus on the more eccentric, obsessional, if not slightly unhinged aspects of British cycling?
I don't think I'm going to dispute that. I think people have called it, people say niche quite a lot, and I think, but people also say about those books that they're sort of a niche within a niche. So I feel like I am really delving in quite deep into this, it's like esoteric world, I guess, of British cycling. So I don't think I dispute that. And I think it's sort of, when you get down into that sort of layer, it just throws up characters, I think, and I guess that's what's, so you got one book really, the book about hill climbs, which is as narrow as it can get, I think. There's a huge number of characters in there, and I have these interviews with them that I sort of transcribe and talk about. And then the second book is more singular because it focuses on Alf Engers, and he almost, I think, in many ways defines a lot of that sort of 1950s, 60s and 70s British cycling, and its like arcane kind of habits. And I guess, yeah.
All of the books in some ways really focus on amateur cycling. Is there something about the culture of amateur cycling that it is naturally slightly obsessive, as far as you can see, slightly eccentric in British sporting culture?
Yeah, and I think the reasons for that are fairly sort of well established, I think, aren't they, in a sense? Like amateur cycling and how it came about and all that divergence from the continent and all of that stuff is fairly sort of clear. But I think that obsessional side of it, in a way, is there, and I don't know. I guess I'm sort of obsessed with that amateur thing, and I'm obsessed with the whatever it is that happens in that milieu, as opposed to this kind of continental framework, which, I feel like there's an element of English cycling which is utterly sort of authentic in many ways. It's not to say that other things aren't, but it's kind of bizarrely narrow and sort of focused. And I think I sort of get obsessed with that and the characters within that, and the amateur ideal, and the fact that people are bike racing and they're taking it incredibly seriously, and they're giving over a huge proportion of their energy and their time to it, but actually it's time and energy that they don't necessarily have in easy sort of supply, because they have to work. And you know, the Alf Anger story is a classic for that, because he was a night baker, you know, and he was obsessed with work and family life and money, and he was obsessed with time in that respect, as well as being a racing cyclist who's obsessed with time. So those sort of odd, those juxtapositions, I guess, became really important to me, and they were important to me. They still are, because my background is as a sort of club cyclist and the traditions of clubs and stuff like that, really.
Part of what we wanted to get at tonight is how people go about writing about something like cycling, which is, you know, of its moment, it is sort of, you know, you can, whether it's a sort of a time trial, or whether it's you know, an endurance event, it's not something you can't write while you're cycling. It's not something that's easy to record. So how do you go about writing about cycling, reconstructing those sort of aspects of British cycling culture?
I think wherever possible, it's mostly done through these sort of long form interviews that I do, and I just, you know, it is actually, you know, I just use this like tiny little sort of, it's almost quite old school now, but it is a digital thing, and I just go and I meet people, and I just usually spend quite a bit of time with them, and just, if I need to go back again, and I just do, you know, come back with hours and hours and hours of audio, and then I just transcribe the lot, and then that really is how I do it. And I, you know, I do obviously do a lot of research beforehand, but I think where I don't know why I do it like that. I think it's because I thought that's what you're supposed to do. Like, I think I always felt like you're supposed to interview people, and just, you know, and I think that's right. I don't think I'm saying anything weird here. But also I think there's something else in that when I was studying, and when I sort of did an MA in like you know, modern literature and modernism and stuff like that, I got quite into a bit of documentary stuff and Humphrey Jennings and like mass observation. And I don't know if people are familiar with that, but it's not indifferent actually to the sort of stuff that I think maybe Max Leonard and others are doing, where they're saying, what's the voice, how can we capture the voice and foreground that, and how can we really, you know, get that in the front of the mix of what we're doing.
Yeah.
You know, whether that voice is like an image, or whether it actually is a voice, or whether it's the written word. And I think so that sort of, you know, maybe that's a stretch, but I do think that, you know, I was watching a lot of things like Humphrey Jennings and reading a lot of mass observation. I was reading the David Kynaston books, and I just got into the idea of testimony and narrative, and then it just really is then it just becomes a decision as to how you make it work, I guess.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
Yeah.
So your latest book explores the history and people behind various attempts on the end-to-end record, but it's described in the blurb, as I do a bit of promotion work for you here, a compelling exploration of why journeys matter for all of us. So what is it that cycling teaches us? I mean, you have this kind of interesting time and in character. What do you think it is that cycling and writing about cycling teaches, or reading about cycling teaches us?
I think that's a hard question, isn't it? And it is just, I don't know, cycling is just, you know, like, it's just a prism, isn't it? Like it's a way in which I try and find meaning, really. And I can be quite a wobbly person. And I think when people read the end-to-end book, they'll see there's a whole series of chapters in there that actually depict me having a really wobbly time. And I think when I wrote that book, which is out in April, you know, there's all the standard stuff there, these interviews with these obsessed people doing like just mad things, like riding from Land's End to John O'Groats in 43 hours. I'm just like, how is that even possible? Who would do that, you know, without, you know, some catastrophic injury or something, you know? But within that, I didn't expect to be doing it, but I was having a bit of a weird time. And I think that the books themselves, for me, I've always tried to say something more about why these things matter. Like, you know, in the classic cliches, they're not just books about cycling. A lot of people would say actually they are just books about cycling, but they are books that are about time, and about things like how much time we have, and how we find happiness, and when we're driven into these obsessions, you know, why are we obsessed? Why are we doing it? And you know, often it's this, you know, you don't need to be a to have had therapy or whatever people have, to know that often there's a reason why we're obsessed with stuff. And those are the things that I'm trying to always unspool a little bit. And I think the thing about the new book is actually I pulled on a thread, and then I didn't realize actually I was pulling on a thread that was actually about me and some of the decisions I'd made at that point in time.
Okay.
And I have that thread of happiness and contentment became really, really something. And I think when I handed it into the publisher, they were a bit shocked, and I don't know if they were horrified or not, but I think then they felt that actually it did work. So they didn't sort of say, because it wasn't the book that I don't think it was the book they bought, like, put it that way. But they weren't unhappy with that, because I think maybe it ticked a few boxes that publishers like, these days, which is, oh look, someone's mental health is in a state of disrepair, and then like pound signs go off. Oh, we can tell that to the Guardian, and we can get them on the Saturday Live talking about their breakdown. Hooray!
Or Sunday evening on Zoom.
Yeah, exactly that. But so I guess maybe it's like I'm trying to, when I write, I'm trying to find what is the simple joy in things. And cycling is an example where people get together, they try to find transcendence, and sometimes people just have an impact on other people's lives in a very, very like beautifully minor way that we don't even notice at the time, we pick up later. And I think it's all those little threads.
Great, thanks. Okay, so if you're starting to, if you've got questions that you might want to ask Paul later on, please put them in the chat. Melanie will keep a track of them, and she'll let me know. I'm glad to say Isabel has joined us now, but Isabel, I'm going to give you a few minutes to settle in. You're muted at the moment, so we can't hear what you're saying.
Sorry, I'm here now, under a pseudonym for the first time. Sorry, I stole my boyfriend's computer, which has a better microphone, but I didn't realise I had to actually change his identity. But anyway, now you know.
There's quite a bit of feedback on your mic, actually.
Oh, okay.
I'd actually, could you mute yourself? We'll move to Marlon first, and then I'll to you, and then we'll do Ian after you, if that's okay with Marlon and Ian. So Marlon, would you like to unmute yourself and put your video on? Great, thanks. So Marlon, you're like Paul, I suppose, to a certain extent, you use narrative inquiry as a method for teaching and learning on race equality. Did you use a similar approach when working with Black British cycling champions?
Completely. My research is grounded in taking oral testimonies from my respondents and aiming to fuse them for a better understanding of our current conditions. So I guess the academic term for my use of this work is autoethnography. So it's a study of the self. It's a study of the culture and your position in that culture. And so in this case for cycling, this is me as a Black British man in the culture of cycling, aiming to understand my condition through the stories of those who've come before me, the stories of those who were there at the same time, those people who are of a similar identity to me. So Black British people who have come into cycling and who have competed, and sort of aiming to understand their experiences, really, so that I can sort of build upon that knowledge for myself.
And you've so in addition, as I said in the introduction, in addition to the book that's coming out next year, you also did an exhibition, I think, didn't you, around Black British cycling?
Yeah, I mean, the writing that's coming from that work wasn't my intention to sort of come up with a book for it, to tell the truth. It was really to showcase the talent that wasn't really being spoken about because of the dominant discourses that were being spoken about. So, since 2008, really, with the Olympics in the UK, in Beijing, and 2012 and 2016, all of that championing of those cyclists meant that the cyclists of colour, the Black cyclists that I knew of in Britain, I mean, you know, not many people knew about those stories and those real intricacies in those stories. So, for example, I mean, one of the exhibitions that I did at Herne Hill, London, was when I brought together Brad Wiggins and Russell Williams, and not many people would have known that Brad Wiggins, that his mentor, was a black man, was a black champion cyclist. So it was just sort of making people aware that black people in Britain have had a fantastic, that they've made a fantastic contribution to the cycling community, and those black champions that we know of now have raced against the best that they've been. So Maurice Burton raced with Eddie Merckx, with Patrick Sercu. He beat Daniel Morland, who was, you know, in the sprint back in 1975, and yet Maurice was denied a place to go to the Olympics. David Clark raced with Grant Thomas, with Christian House. You know, so yeah, just allowing people to know that there is black excellence in the sport, and to sort of raise the profile through the exhibitions. And so what's come from that now is you know, I've been invited to write quite a few articles this year, but what's come from this now is me writing this book, Desire, Discrimination, Determination, the Black Champions in Cycling. But it's not just from a British perspective. I'm taking much more of an international look at the experiences. And so, yeah, this takes into account, you know, the lives and the careers of people like Major Taylor, Kitty Knox, David Weller, Bourget, you know, Justin Williams. So I'm bringing together all of those experiences through a particular framework that I've created, which will allow us to understand more about the black experience in the sport from a historical and international perspective.
Thanks. What do the stories you've recovered tell us about cycling in Britain, and how far do these tally with your own experience as a racing cyclist?
Well, I mean, the stories don't essentialise the black experience at all. I mean, you know, there are some black cyclists who've come into the sport who've had quite a good path in terms of they've been accepted by dominant white clubs and they've been mentored, and there's been some other black cyclists who haven't had that experience as well. What is quite a significant pattern is that where the cyclists do make progress and do aim to represent their country, Great Britain, at the Olympics or the World Championships, they've always been denied that opportunity. And I think there's been a similar pattern of that in the USA. Certainly, but again, you can't essentialise that across the board, because when you look at France, for example, when you look at people like Bourget, when you look at people like Mary Devine, they've gone on to become world champions. And so, I mean, so you can't essentialise the experience across the world. But everyone suffered from racism, whether it be direct racism, you know, that form of violence. You know, the form of violence that Major Taylor faced back in his day was a threat to his life, and that's probably not the same as what, say, Kevin Razor faced at the Tour de France, which was a different form of violence. You know, that verbal abuse. So yes, it's about bringing together these stories and looking at what those patterns are. And aiming to understand how we can make cycling much more inclusive. So, you know, it hopefully will bring learning to everybody, because there's a lot of people out there sort of aiming to look at these issues and they're kind of poking in the dark. And I think what you've got to do is really go deep down into the history to understand whether whether there are any similar patterns today that we can change for the future.
Thanks. What kind of reaction have you had so far to your work?
From the public? I mean,
generally. Yeah,
I mean, the public that have come to the exhibitions I haven't imposed the stories upon them. I've just laid out the photographs. I've laid out some of the oral testimonies, and I gave them a sort of feedback sheet, and all of them recognised the double sort of edged sword of the exhibition, where at one point you're celebrating these cyclists, but at the other point you're recognising, you know, the discrimination and those large mountains that they had to climb. At a larger perspective from sort of national bodies like British Cycling, they've been, you know, they've embraced the exhibition. I think at the beginning they were a bit fearful of it in terms of what kind of, you know, in terms of what it was going to portray and how that was going to relate to their reputation. But these are raw oral testimonies, and the cyclists that I work with were open. They wanted to tell their stories from their perspectives, and national bodies like British Cycling need to be able to sort of face up to those experiences and those truths, and to be able to sort of transform from that.
Yeah. Okay, great. So if you've got questions for Marlon, bring them, plug it into the chat. You don't need to tell us what the question is, and we'll come back to you at the end. We're going to move on to Isabel now. So thanks, Marlon. Do you want to unmute yourself, or John?
I'm unmuted. I hope you're not getting too much feedback this time.
No, that's perfect. No, that's great. So I'll just introduce you, because we didn't do this at the beginning. So Isabel came to cycling relatively late in life, although she's always enjoyed cycling as a child. Her parents would take her and her brothers on excursions in the Shropshire countryside where she grew up. But it was after moving to France that Isabel developed a professional and personal interest in endurance cycling and began racing. Most importantly, it was here in 2004 that she took up marathon running and endurance cycling at the same time, becoming particularly interested in the latter after completing the L'Étape du Tour in Auvergne. So this was a 238-kilometre tour stage with 4,300 metres of...
I didn't pick the easiest one to start with.
Yeah, and this is a week before the tour riders do it. So it's about the time that Isabel became a freelance cycling journalist, and she's since written for Pro Cycling, Rouleur, and cyclingnews.com, amongst others, and is the author of Queens of Pain, Legends and Rebels of Cycling, and has a new book coming out, written with Raphael Geminiani, no less, Raincoats Are for Tourists, which maybe you can tell us more about later on. But you rediscovered cycling about the same time that you became a freelance journalist. So is there a connection?
Yeah, definitely. Well, you know, it's funny because when I did the Étape du Tour was like a bargain I did with my boyfriend, because I wanted to run a marathon. And he said, well, I'll train with you if in turn we both sign up for L'Étape du Tour. And we were moving to France. It was like, this is our new beginning. And so I sort of said yes, without realizing what I was letting myself in for. And, you know, I thought maybe you'd stop and have lunch in a restaurant or something halfway through. And then I didn't realize actually it's pretty serious. You know, you can't stop and you're on a time limit. And I really didn't think, I just didn't think I was going to be able to do it, because it was just so, you know, just a crazy distance. And, you know, I was just, I was not a particularly serious cyclist. I'd just been commuting to work. You know, that was my main cycling and touring holidays. And so when I managed to do that, when I did the marathon, I just really, it was this, I just never thought of myself as a sporty person. And I just did not think I was capable of doing something like that. And it was this, it just gave me so much self-confidence, you know, because you think you know yourself really well by the time you're 30, and you know, you think you've kind of worked out what you can do and what you can't do. And I just didn't think that I could do either of those things. And so around the same time I was trying to become a freelance journalist, and that was quite a nerve-wracking thing to do. And it really gave me the confidence to sort of pursue the writing as well, because I sort of thought, you know, it was so basic, but it's just, you know, if I can do this, or if you can do this, if you just kind of put your mind to it and put in the training, what else can you do, you know?
Is that kind of discipline that's associated with training? Is that the same process that you use when you're writing?
There's no discipline when I'm writing. There's lots of coffee and wine in the evenings, uppers and downers. No, I think actually it's a funny thing, because writing Queens of Pain in particular was very painful in some ways, because it was quite an intense, it was an intense period. I wrote it and researched it in a period of about 6 months. And it was this sort of roller coaster, and it was exhilarating and really exciting, discovering all these stories. But there is a sort of thing, I think it's like that thing when you're doing a race and you've just got to put your head down and you've got to keep going, and it's going to come to an end at some point, and you just so you like go through the pain. And I had lots of I had quite a few all-nighters, or I'm freelance, I've got children, it's just like quite hard to juggle and find the time to do things, and I actually really like writing at night anyway. I said it's kind of calm, and I have my that's my moment where I kind of really go into depth in things. And it did feel a bit like that endurance sport thing, writing. It's not, I don't think it's really so unhealthy writing, actually, sitting hunched behind the desk. But I think there's a lot of parallels between that endurance thing and that thing of really, you have to be quite courageous as well. Writing, I know that sounds a bit strange, but I find when I'm writing, I actually hate everything I write as I'm writing. I think it's all terrible, and there's nothing lonelier than when you've got a deadline on something and you've got to turn it in and you don't like anything that you've written. And I think a lot of writers have that experience, and you can only really get a sense of whether you've written something that's okay maybe a year later when you read it again. So and I think you sometimes you just have to kind of put your head down and you go deep into something and you're not really sure. You just have to sort of trust your instincts a bit and hope it comes out all right in the end, or you sort of know that you're going to finish at some point. That kind of gives you the courage. But I think it requires a certain degree of determination and a kind of grit, I think, that you get from writing as well.
Was it difficult getting publishers to take an interest in Queens of Pain? Given the market, especially around Christmas, seems to be awash with biographies of sort of the grand dame, as they say in French, of Grand Tour racing.
Yeah, no, actually, well, in fact, it was a really happy coincidence with Rafa, who published Queens of Pain, because I'd contacted them about the Geminiani book, this idea that I had, and they were like, "Oh, that's great. We're really keen on that. But we also want to do this book on women cyclists." And they did a book a few years ago called Kings of Pain, which is a translation of a lovely book by Philippe Brunel, who's a great French journalist, celebrating the sort of great male champions. And it's sort of all these beautiful photos, and it's very macho, and it's like very heroic, and and all iconic. And they wanted to do a women's version, and they said, "Would you be?" And it was just like, "Yes, I really want to do this," because I'd also been like wanting to do a women's book. I just thought it's just ridiculous. There's nothing out there giving us a history of who the great women are. There's not even any, And I talked to my agent about it, and he's like, "Oh, I just think it's going to be really difficult to sell at the moment at the current market." So it was just this really happy, lucky coincidence. I was just really delighted that they asked me, and it was just a really lovely project to work on. I was so happy to work on it. It was, because I had sort of ideas, and everyone knows of a few famous great female riders, and the idea was to really celebrate great female champions from the past. But how many people can name more than 5? Or I think even getting to 10 is stretching it for most people. And as I started digging, I mean, I didn't know, I knew of the great figures like Beryl Burton and Eileen Sheridan and Alfonsina Estrada and stuff. But there was just like so many great stories. And it was really, really hard because I actually had to... I couldn't put everyone in that I wanted to. I would have liked to have written a book like 3 times as long. But, I was really trying to find women who were sort of really representative of their era and trying to have a continuous line of champions. And it starts in the 1890s and goes up to the 1990s, because the modern period is just too many to write about. So it's just it historic. And there was a sort of the period where women's cycling started becoming a professional sport. So it just seemed like a nice time frame to kind of put them in that. Yeah.
Great. Okay. So if you've got questions for Isabel specifically, just flag it in the chat and we'll come back to you. So thanks, Isabel. We'll give you questions in a minute, I'm sure. So moving on to Ian Walker. So Isabel, if I could get you to mute yourself.
Oh, yep, mute.
So that we can see you. Thank you. So Ian, sorry, I know. Ian, when we first met, you were an ultra distance runner. What happened?
I got seduced by the possibility of doing something harder. I was running, and I was kind of loving running. So actually, I was just really fascinated with what Isabel was just describing a moment ago about the going through life not feeling like a sporty person, because I literally managed that for 40 years. I left school absolutely convinced that I had no ability in sport, and moreover, as a result of that, I left school feeling I had no interest in sport whatsoever. And if you'd met me 10 years ago, I could have given you detailed, complex arguments about why sport is an evil thing that should be banned from the face of the earth. I was not rejoicing at the 2012 Olympics and things like that. And then I had this sort of revelation, almost literally on the eve of turning 40, when a friend just invited me out of the blue to take part in an ultramarathon. And just on a whim, just a really impetuous moment, I just went, yeah, why not? Let's do it. And just started running almost overnight, literally overnight. And that's when we first met. And, the running was amazing. And one of the things that was particularly amazing about that ultra distance running world is the people who are in it. It is just full of some of the nicest, most welcoming people. And that goes right through the whole length of the sport. Whether it's a local run organized by a few people in a park, or whether it's, essentially the world championship, everyone's welcome, everyone's made to feel welcome. And, it's such a kind of underground sport that you can literally go and stand on the start line with the best runners in the world and have a go. And, they would shake your hand and see you at the finish 12 hours before. And it's that really welcoming world. But, I think the thing that made me make that jump to the cycling was a matter of scale. So the running is extra, and ultra running tends to congregate around this 100-mile distance. There's other distances, but for some reason 100 miles seems to have become the thing that people really focus on. And there's an American runner called Anne Trason who just dominated the sport throughout the 90s, and she had this really incredible phrase that I like of running 100 miles is like living your life in a day. Because what you do when you run 100 miles, hopefully in a day, is, your life just goes completely on hold, and every facet of your mind is focused entirely for this period on just the process of moving forward. And I became fascinated by that process and by how 100% consuming it became to just be focused on the process of moving forward. It's really meditative, that you forget your normal life and just be consumed by this process of movement. And so to finally answer your question, the thing that made me do that jump from the running to the cycling was the greater scale of the cycling races that I saw. So I was so fascinated by that process of movement and being 100% focused. When I learned about the Transcontinental race, and I saw that this race went on for maybe 2 weeks, I thought, wow, I've had this extraordinary experience of putting my life on a shelf for a day and being 100% focused. What must that be like when it's 14 times longer? And I just had to have it. And I literally stopped running the next day, bought a bike and started cycling instead.
So what is it about that? What does that feel like then, that 2-week race experience for those of us who would probably end up divorced if we ever tried it?
It's really interesting you say that. And I think tonight is the right time to try and explain this, that And I've just written a book about the process of what it's like to do these kind of journeys, and it was really hard to write because, I think I used the phrase meditative a moment ago, and that's what it's like. I can spend 10 days, 12 days, 14 days sitting on a bike, completely consumed by the process of going forward as fast as possible. And then at the end of that, it's almost like there's nothing left in my mind. It's all, as soon as the ride's over, it's almost like it happened to somebody else. And so probably the nearest I can explain to what it's like to do that is to say that it always feels like there's two parts. It's like my mind splits into two parts, and you've got this incredibly busy part of my mind that is just constantly churning away and thinking, and it's thinking about when can I next stop? What food do I need? Do I need to do any repairs? Where will I sleep tonight? And all of these mundane but really essential things. And that part of my mind is thrashing away. And I like to think of it as a bit like the legs on a swan, that those parts are thrashing away under the surface. Actually, no, it's the other way. It's the legs on a swan that's fallen upside down, because they're the bits on the surface and they're thrashing away up in the air. And then underneath that is me, who's just gliding along serenely, because this bit up top is taking care of everything.
So how do you write about
that duality that is interesting?
So how do you get a book out of that? If it's so focused, so narrowly focused on those three things?
Yeah, well, it was actually, quite a challenge to write a book about it without it being incredibly tedious. And obviously it's hard for me to judge whether that's being successful or not. But yeah, a huge part of writing about it was to really, really deliberately try not to make it a chain of events. It was very tempting to sit down afterwards with maps and say, oh yeah, right, so I went through there, and I went through there, and I went through there. Let's just describe those places and what happened. And it became quite important, and it was quite a serious editing process to stop myself from doing that and to try to describe the mental journey much more. And one of the things that I really did try to focus on was the wider lessons that come from this. Because one of the things that fascinates me about the process of this, both with the running and the cycling, and I really do talk about how one fed into the other, but there's a thing about the process of this ultra distance sport that I find fascinating, which is I discovered along the way, it kind of provides a reasonably safe test bed where you can practice dealing with difficulty. It's just a facet of the human condition, is that we all have to deal with difficulty from time to time. And making yourself run 50 miles, run 100 miles, or cycle 1,000 kilometers or something like that, it's going to hurt. There will be times when it's really hard. Any of those things, there will be moments where you just feel you cannot go on. And it gives you an opportunity to learn techniques or learn strategies for dealing with difficulty. And it's like a lot of things, you get skilled at something through repetition. If you want to be a great violinist, you've got to repeat doing things over and over again. And it's a bit like that. It's almost like you're trying to become a virtuoso sufferer in a way, that by putting yourself in difficulty on a regular basis, you just learn strategies and skills for dealing with difficulty. And that's one of the things that I really found fascinating. So a huge chunk of the book really rotates around that theme.
Okay, great. So we're going to open things up for questions now. So could I ask Paul, Marlon, and Isabel and Ian to put their videos back on, and mic's off if you like, or mic's on, up to you. I think the first question is from Julia. So I'm kind of scrolling through chat here as well. Julia, do you want to unmic yourself and unmute yourself even, and then fire away?
Hello. A lot of the books on cycling are, to quote Emily Chappell, man wins race. And without wanting to disparage the amazing books that you've all written, you're all talking about racing. You're all talking about world records. You're all talking about competitive endeavors. And yet cycling is so much more than just competitive riding. There are notable books that get away from this. Emily Chappell's What Goes Around, Helen Lloyd's 2 books, Desert Snow and Siberian Winter's Tale. But why is it that there is so little otherwise that is about cycling in a non-competitive, non-chasing records point of view? Why isn't there more than just man wins race?
That's a great question. Who wants to tackle that one?
Well, I could start off. I think first of all, racing, it just is. There's the drama of racing, isn't there? So it's just compelling, and I think racing has the Tour de France. I don't know how many people watch it. It's just insane. I think people find races really compelling, and I think there are good books. Dervla Murphy. There's some great writers writing about using their bicycle as a way to explore countries and travel and discover things. And I think, I completely agree. I think it is a bit crazy. There's like so many biographies of male champions, and like, why is there not space for, surely there's like so many people are cycling now. It's really fantastic. And, I find cycling is it is this kind of crazy tribal world. And does it have to really be like that? Like so many, I think also you're seeing that now with professional cycling, when you're seeing riders doing like the EF Drapac riders who've been doing the gravel racing. I think people are more open, and the whole whatever it's called, bike packing fashion, that's basically just touring, isn't it? I don't know, but it's like not cool to call it touring. So I don't know. I think it's a terrible shame that you have all these tribal things in cycling, because basically it's just such a pleasure to be on a bike, whether you're racing or not. And so I think there's room for more. There should be more books on this broader experience of riding. But racing is compelling. It is exciting, and I think with my book on Queens of Pain, I took a very conscious decision to write just about cycling champions, racing champions, and not, there was a point where I was thinking, well, should I, there's so many great women from the history of cycling, like Annie Londonderry, I think her name was. I think her actual real name was Kopchowski or something. She was this great 1890s American rider who rode around the world. And it was to prove that it could be done. And I didn't include her in the book in the end. And I didn't include Kitty Knox in the book in the end, who has an amazing story, a black campaigning female cyclist in the 1890s, who Marlon, I think, has written about, thankfully. But because they weren't racing, and I felt like there's so many kind of books on positioning these great male riders as iconic racing cyclists, and I felt we needed to have a book on iconic females. I wanted to find the female equivalents of Fausto Coppi. So that's my excuse for focusing on racing cyclists with the women. But there are some great books on I forgot. I'll find the name of the author. Yeah.
It's a privilege to compete anyway, and this is what I'll be very brief. The cyclists in my book are fighting for the opportunity to compete at some point in this particular world, and that some of them are being denied the opportunity to compete at their best. So you've got that other side of the story there. As well as that, there are some voices in my book that aren't necessarily the athletes who go on to become national champions or European champions and so on. I've got the voices of grassroots leaders, black leaders who are aiming to sort of just encourage black people to come into the sport of cycling for recreation. They're just as important as the black champions in this book as well. So there's a variety of voices in my book, not just the athletes who go on to become champions or are stopped from racing at their best. So that's what I'm trying to. I'm trying to give a diversity of voices in that respect.
Thanks. Why we've sort of an adjunct question here from Julian. I've got a question from Julian and then one from Judith. Did you want to ask your question? It's in the chat, but I'll let you ask it aloud if you like.
Hi there, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a question actually about non-fiction. I know we're all talking about, it's about fiction. I know we're all talking about non-fiction, but it struck me that there is so little fiction I've come across. I've read some lousy fiction books sort of involving the milieu of cycling over the years. Obviously, the rider sits there above it all. But why is there so little powerful fiction about cycling? Thanks.
Who wants to?
So shall I jump in with a quick thought?
Yeah.
Start the ball rolling. This is purely speculative because, of course, I hadn't thought about this until your very good question just appeared. But I think my first thought would be it's something to do with how society views cycling. I think, and obviously this is very broad brush, and you can take objection to what I'm going to say, but our society views cycling, I would suggest, as primarily two things: professional sport and a frivolous leisure activity. And if you want to understand the difficulty of being allowed to cycle safely on the street, you kind of have to understand that a lot of people view cycling as those two things. And given that, it's perhaps difficult, if you want to understand, a lot of the public just view cycling as a thing that is really for kids. And, it's a little bit like saying, and this is wrong, but in the minds of some people, it's like saying, why are there no great novels about skateboarding? Because cycling wrongly occupies a similar view in a lot of people's minds. And that potentially provides a barrier to exploring what the mode provides as much as we should be doing, because to a lot of people, it's not given the seriousness that it deserves. There's a thought.
Yeah, it's funny. It's something that I've always been surprised by as well, because there's lots of really good fiction about running, and one of my favourite books is a Penguin literary companion to running, which is full of great short stories, very different voices, and there are other sports that have good. I don't know whether it's I think maybe the fact that cycling is just quite marginal, isn't it? I think. Perhaps it's just not sexy enough. I don't know. I mean, there's two films in the 80s, those American films. I forgot what they're called. Breaking Away, I think is, and I forgot what the other one's called. And I think cycling had a real sort of beatnik appeal in America at that point, because it wasn't mainstream and it was like a kind of cool alternative kids thing. And I think it had a certain glamour that. Made it possible to make those films at that point, and I don't know whether cycling has that glamour.
there are some French examples. Henri Desgranges, who founded the Tour de France, actually wrote a novel as well. It's terrible, but I don't know why there are no more novels about cycling.
I don't think there's that many good novels about sport. Like, there are, but they're pretty rare. And I think that it's easy for us, all our cycling acolytes here, to say, oh look, why aren't there good books about cycling? And we always fall back to the rider or whatever. But actually, good novels, good fictional books about sport are pretty rare. You might have David Peace, or you might have Alan Silito, or I don't know. But like, I really, and I read a lot, and I haven't, the closest I've got to a good book about cycling is maybe like one paragraph in Ernest Hemingway, or like, but the same applies, I think, to pretty much everything. The opening of Underworld's got quite a good bit about baseball, but like, there's not that many compelling, there are, but there aren't that many compelling sport novels. And I think someone said in the comments here that actually the non-fictional drama that happens is so compelling. When Roger Vivier going off a cliff and being roped back up with a broken back and inner tubes.
You don't need any more drama, do you?
I mean, yeah, or Jeannie Longo's life story, or like or the books that Emily Chappell is writing, and the book, both Where There's a Will and her book What Goes Around, the way that everything is woven within that, and stories about life. What really, where are you going to go with that? And it's a pretty literary form, and I think that's why I like it. I don't know.
We're going to move on to Judith's question, which I think is for Isabel, and then we've got a question from Clara as well. Yes. Is it Judith?
Is it a research question?
No, I think that was one from Clara. I thought we had another question from...
Yeah, I know.
Judith, there we are. Judith, did you have a question?
Yeah, we do. Do you have to? Yeah. Did you notice any difference over the decades in how the women you studied got into racing?
That's really a really interesting question. I think a lot of them got into racing through boyfriends, actually. Funnily enough, I think there's a lot of stories of women who, and through friendships and a kind of a social thing. And it's funny because it was really just not a mainstream thing to do at all. And a lot of the times when they were racing, you have some people who are just incredibly determined, like Alfonsina Strada. Like, there's no one encouraging her. She just did that all on her own. But Beryl Burton wasn't really a cyclist, and when she met her boyfriend, who became her husband, he got her into cycling, and there's this very sweet quote thing that he said about how, the first year when she joined the club, they were having to push her a bit on the club rides, and by the third year she was just dropping everyone. So there's a lot of stories of women who got into cycling through who kind of just sort of fell into it, or the Hager sisters, the Dutch sisters, who are just a great story, fantastic families, a farming family in the Netherlands, and it was their dad who would go on he was a sort of member of a touring club, and he'd take his oldest daughters on club outings with them. That seems to have been quite a common theme, and I think it still is. And I think, to be honest, I think that's the same for all riders. I think there's a family thing of having someone. You can't become. I remember talking to a sports psychologist I was doing an article about siblings in cycling, and this sports psychologist said you can't underestimate how important family is for high level athletes. You can't. If you don't have your parents backing you and getting you, supporting you and taking you to races and stuff, you're never going to make it. Whatever sport it is. So that seems to have been I think it's quite rare, the stories of women discovering cycling. I didn't come across that many of them kind of discovering cycling for themselves. Actually, the first woman that I write about, what's her name? Terrible, I've forgotten. The amazing 19th century American rider, and she definitely found it herself. But then her route into becoming a professional cyclist was, again, she met her boyfriend was a professional rider. She got into cycling on her own, but he was the one who kind of helped her get to this next level, and he became her kind of coach and accompanied her incredible ascent. Tilly Anderson, yeah.
Great, thank you. So Clara's question is for everybody. So Clara, can I hand over to you?
Oh, sure. I didn't expect to be talking. Thanks for all this insight. It's been great. I just was wondering, when you are doing your research, how do you cope with all of it? How do you organize it? I know it's totally overwhelming for me, and I struggle with it. So I was hoping that you could give some advice or any tips as far as that go, because I'm a journalist. I interview dozens of people, and then I just don't want to transcribe it or anything. That's the part that really takes a lot of
I have no advice. No sensible advice.
Just do it.
I'm in the same boat as you. Maybe you can give me some tips.
I'm sure it's perfectly normal. I just want
yeah.
I guess from a research perspective, it's via thematic analysis. So, I mean, the question that Isabel's just answered about how did you get into it, that was one of the first. That's actually going to be a chapter in my book. Actually, how did you get into it? And what we found was that, I think Isabel's mentioned about family. It was the fathers of a lot of these cyclists that got these guys into it. Otherwise, they got into the sport via convenience. But I guess with the overall research made in Britain, which is expanded out now to an international thing, the simple question was, how were you made in Britain as a person, as a cyclist? So, which part of Britain did you come from? Which was the first club you joined? Who were your mentors? What was your most memorable race as a child? What was the first championship you won? What kind of racism did you face? So if you've got those key questions, and if you're asking the same questions of the respondents, and you can draw up the themes, you can do some thematic analysis, and then you can aim to sort of bring those together to explore for congruency in that respect. And in my case, because it's very much an auto-ethnographical approach, I can understand my own sort of condition in the sport through the stories of others. So that might be one way of doing it.
Yeah. I find that the thing of transcribing things is such a torture, and I try and not transcribe everything, but in the end I always do. And I find when you transcribe something, so much more comes out. That's why I always kind of listen to my interviews again. And I think I think there's the thing of I think, like Marlon says, you have your sort of questions that you tend to, the same questions that you're asking people if you're doing something. I think our books are quite similarly structured, I suspect, and I think we've kind of had, so I think there's similar themes in how we've approached it. But I think you have what I try and do is I try and write things up without going through my tapes and my notes too much. I try and find, because when you're trying to sift through this kind of huge soup of information, it's really overwhelming. And so I try and think, I try and go for my gut feeling about, like, what are the things that really, the stuff that I find really exciting, or really, instead of thinking about the reader, I sort of sometimes I feel like I'm writing for friends, and I'm like thinking, oh, I must tell, this is the thing I would tell in a story, if we were having a chat in the pub or whatever. So I sort of, I will kind of try and get that down first, and that in the end sort of becomes a bit my kind of structure, and then I go back into the transcripts, and then I completely change everything and rewrite it, and it wouldn't take hours over it. But I think you have to have your key questions. That becomes your structure, doesn't it? I think that's how you hook. You have to have a skeleton somewhere of ideas to work out, and then you try and sneak everything else in, and then you take it all out again and try and sneak it in other ways, and it comes out again, and you lose lots of sleep.
The only thing I'd add, like in horribly practical terms, is that when I'm writing a book, I do tend, there's the thematic overview, but for my own survival, I break it down into a series of essays almost. It is chapters at the end of the day, and each chapter is between 2,500 and 4,000 words. And then that sounds a bit unromantic, but they're like, when I do that and I compartmentalize it down, it means I can manage the materials a lot easier. I think I'm stating the obvious, but I guess that's how I get through, over what can be like 2.5-3 years of dissolution.
I think the other thing that's really difficult is you often have things that it's like you try and have a structure, and then you find that things connect in unexpected ways. And I find that's one of the biggest challenges in writing, is like how to you want to like say everything all at the same time, and you can't. You've got to like, you know, how you've got to like think of the poor reader, and you know, how are they going to wade through this information? Yeah, I don't, you know, I find that really hard, that thing of respecting the structure that you give yourself as well. You know.
Phil's got a question which totally anticipates the question I was going to ask, so I'm going to hand over to Phil because it ties in very nicely with this, I think.
Okay, thanks. And thanks for the really fascinating insights, discussion. My question is, with the proliferation of social media and the increasing need for instant gratification, as well as the widespread availability of video, is it becoming more difficult to write about cycling, particularly in longer form? And what do you see as the future of cycling writing?
Can I just really quickly say, I think I think there's always scope for good writing, and I know that sounds like a clumsy answer, but I think when I see a lot of this reduced content, sometimes it really grabs me, and sometimes it's absolute rubbish.
Yeah.
And I think people are always drawn to a really, really compelling story, and I don't think that's going to change. And I think people are drawn to long form, and you know that, you know, maybe I'm showing my own kind of naivety, but I do read a huge amount, and I'm always craving like a decent bit of prose, really.
I completely agree with that. I think there's room for everything, really. I mean, you know, you want the short hit little news bites and things, but you know, there's that. I always find that online that I just find it so frustrating. You can never really go in deep on stuff. You know, there's always like, it's always the same 3 bits of information that get recycled when you're, you know, and that's the beauty of long form journalism. You have someone, you know, when you have, it's just so refreshing reading something when someone's really sort of dived into something and explored it, and you know, done proper research and asked lots of questions, and it's always like really fresh, and there's new stuff in there, and I think the long form writing gives you the opportunity to really explore stuff and unearth things, you know. You know, I mean, I'm just thinking about my own book. There are some chapters where, you know, I did a chapter on Millie Robinson, who was this great writer in the 50s, British pioneer, and no one really knew anything about her. And, you know, even her local club, you know, everyone had forgotten her. And it took me months of like emailing people until someone finally put me in touch with her nephew, who was this incredible, had all this amazing information. And you don't have the time for that with quick turnaround journalism. And it was just absolutely fantastic when I got onto him and I got all this extra detail. And you know, but it's a really slow process. And that's the thing with long form journalism. You have this time to accumulate little nuggets of information, and you know, it's kind of more nuanced. You know, you've got more layers of stuff going on. And I just think people love reading long form. I think there's always going to be an audience. If people love reading, they love reading long form writing. And I think there's you know, there's room for you know, we all want the quick hit news as well, but you know, I think I think they you know, I sort of feel there's always, I can't see it going away, to be honest. I think in anything, I think people want it more now, you know, because it's a refuge from the kind of crazy, frazzly world that we have at the moment. There have been a couple of questions in the chat from Rapid, Rich, and Lucy, but I think I answered those. So did either Rich or Lucy want to come in at this point, or are you happy with the answers that you've had? I'll take silence as a yes, I'm happy. Right, okay, great, you're happy. I suppose coming out of that then, the question I wanted to ask, which I think Phil anticipated to a certain extent, is how difficult do you find it to say something new about cycling? You know, we've sort of mentioned, you know, the sort of not generic, but the sort of the standard biographies of you know, the great champions and you know, any cyclist seems to get for Christmas.
How difficult is it actually saying?
I don't find it difficult. I mean, I was listening to what Phil was saying about his experiences on. So Paul was saying about his experiences of about sort of framing his writing around the sort of British time trial cycling scene, and that's the scene that I've experienced as well. When I first came into cycling, I started off as a time trialist, and I guess being a Black British man walking into those sorts of spaces and seeing that subculture, seeing the quirkiness, seeing the idiosyncrasies of, you know, some riders who are stuck in a particular era and they stay in that particular era because of, you know, they have the bikes of that era, they have the clothes of that era. It's just quirky, and just seeing that from my perspective, my own background identity means that I can offer that perspective that, I don't think the genre is really, there aren't many Black authors that give that sort of that narrative of competitive cycling at grassroots level, I suspect. So that's new. I think with the notion of racism, discrimination, privilege, I think that's not. There's nothing new in that, because when we think about people like Major Taylor, if we think about people back in the day, they all experienced that, but it's been experienced in a different way today. So, yeah, I guess it's a case. And what I'm trying to do is I'm using an aspect of historical consciousness. I'm aiming to understand, the present by looking at the past to generate future possibilities for the sport in terms of diversity and inclusion and representation. And that means taking into account the experiences of the past and the international experiences of this in order to create some kind of new knowledge from it. So from my perspective, in terms of where I'm coming from, I think that this is quite useful to the cycling world.
I think it's fantastic. And, it's the fact that it's, you've got all this amazing material with these people that you've met and talked to that just haven't been written about properly. It's this, it's going to be a amazing journey for all of us to be able to read your book and discover these stories and learn about their experiences, which, that I just think there's always more to learn, isn't there? And it's... the
thing about it is that some of the cyclists who are alive now didn't even know about the other cyclists as well. So,
yeah,
Maurice Burton didn't know about Christian Light, and Christian Light didn't know about David Weller, so
I think, yeah,
didn't know about each other, to tell the truth. So they're finding out for themselves. But yeah, I think it's more the blend. It's not, there's not one particular cyclist that I'm aiming to champion out of all of this. It's the blend of experiences. It's that fusion. So Maurice isn't his story isn't as it's not given a greater platform than the next person, and so on. It's a blend of experiences, so we can understand what we can learn from these experiences in the sport, really.
Yeah.
Okay, we've got time for two final questions. So Rich didn't get to his mic quick enough, so he did want to ask his question. So I'm going to hand over to Rich.
Hi, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. It was literally just my question that I posted up, and I just kind of thought, do you think that writers and journalists have any duty to promote women in cycling and women's equality? And the main reason for that is what's been happening recently in the hill climbing scene, if you're not familiar with it. But there's been a massive push to make sure that women get equal status and equal prize money. Now, I can imagine if you're writing about a certain subject or a certain event or whatever, and this can actually, you may be talking about the men's event because it's overall. So is there any duty to include the women, even though, and again, dare I say it, it's seen in some circles as a lesser event, but obviously it isn't a lesser event, but it's just natural that people always turn to the men as the pinnacle. And I even got pulled up on Facebook over this on a group because I unfortunately, somebody was asking what the result of the National Hill Climb Championship was, and being a male, I answered the questions on the male side because I didn't look at the female side. I got completely slated, and it wasn't to do with that. I wasn't qualified enough to understand who could beat who. So you end up becoming on the wrong side of it. So you as journalists, you as writers, do you feel sometimes even hidden in the background that you, especially in 2020, should you be mentioning women more and supporting them?
I have a lot to say about that, but maybe I've been talking so much, I feel like maybe someone else should have a go first. And I'll unless anyone else, unless you're happy for me to launch in.
Paul might want to say something on this, as I've seen active on Facebook.
Yes.
I think it's interesting when Rich said, "Oh, I don't know if you've been following a hill climb scene," and everyone looked a bit baffled. But yeah, I don't know. The only thing I put in there was that I feel like it's my obligation in a way to try and make sure that all of those stories, the women's racing is covered in the books I write. In the end-to-end book that I've got coming out, it's really, really, I actually, tried to ensure it's as balanced as possible. I don't really know what else kind of to say about it. I feel, I do feel very passionate about it. I'm always acutely aware that I'm writing about something that isn't from my experience. So I'm trying not to patronize, but I'm equally trying to write it because I have a voice to a degree to write it and to push that and to support it. And I think, there's parallels. I think, with anyone who's trying to frame and support different voices.
Isabel, did you want to come in on that?
I'll try and limit myself. But
I think one last question after this.
Well, I think historically, the thing is that racing is and it's one of the sort of arguments that people say, oh, women's racing is not that exciting to watch, and that, why do we watch racing? Because it's exciting and entertaining. And I think in the past, women have been really underserved by being given terribly boring races to do. And it's like, if you're, I sort of put it as I had an analogy in my book where I said, well, you can't ride like Fausto Coppi if you're doing circles around a housing estate. It's you have to be given a stage. And I think in the past, women weren't always given a stage. And I think, like if you're going to report on the, some epic race that the men have got, and you're maybe not going to give so much space to a women's race where they haven't been given such a great stage. That's not an excuse for that. And I think now there's so much, there are really good races for women now. It's really changed a huge amount in the last few years. And there's just terrific riders out there. It's just like there's no reason not to write about them now and not to give them equal coverage. And actually they're more exciting than the men to watch because the women's teams are smaller. So they don't have they can't control the peloton in the same way these big men's teams can. And that makes the racing more unpredictable. And it's just there's so much chutzpah that's going on, and that it's just so I think there's no and the other thing is it's a virtuous circle or vicious circle. If you give people great races and you show it on TV and you can see them racing, it just changes everything. There was I remember watching the women's race of La Course, the sort of women's day that they do during the tour a couple of years ago. I think it was in 2018 maybe, or maybe it wasn't last, it was the summer before. And there was that crazy race with Anna van der Breggen, who looked like she was going to win the stage, but Annemiek van Vleuten had been like chasing her down the mountain, and it was sort of gone on for like 20k, and she was getting closer and closer, but Anna van der Breggen was getting to the finishing line, and then she literally was just about to win the race, and Annemiek van Vleuten pipped her to the post at the end, and it was so exciting. And and you watch a race like that and you see these women looking really fantastic and professional, and it just generates more excitement and interest. So there's no excuse now, but I can understand why in the past journalists perhaps that's not an excuse at all, but I think the thing is journalism is about entertaining your readers, and you have to always remember that. You have to have good stories to tell them. So if women are underserved with not exciting races, then that is a challenge.
Thanks, Isabella. So that's a great answer. We got a really good. I'm going to make it the last question. I'm afraid the chat is really. There's lots of things going on in the chat which are really interesting, but we do have to draw a line somewhere. So I'm going to hand over to Alice, who's got the killer question.
Hello. Sorry, I was just trying to figure out how to unmute. So my question for you all is, and if you're allowed to say, you might not, but what is the book that you would really, really love to write next?
So you can all take it in turn to answer that one. Ian, we haven't heard from you for a while. You tell us. You can answer first.
Yeah, good question. I don't know, and I've obviously been asking myself that a bit recently, and whether I will write another, I don't know. But if it was something, I'd want it to be the book that, you know, in dream scenario, it's the book that in 10 years from now, everyone says, oh, that's the book that got me cycling. That's the one I'd like. So something that feels accessible, something that isn't about being the fastest in the world or something like that. A book that makes ordinary people who've not tried cycling appreciate the enormous joy, and I mean joy in the true sense of the word, that riding a bike under your own steam can bring. And if I could find a way to communicate that well, I'd be very happy.
Marlon.
I haven't finished this one yet, so I'm kind of writing it now. I've got a deadline for January the 1st. And so, but no, I guess you know, I guess one of the questions was about, you know, competitive cyclists, you know, and why do we always write about that? But there's been some characters that have come out of this. I think there's a story of the Manhattan Five, 5 Black American women who did a sort of long bike ride from, I think it was from New York to.
Oh yeah, that's great.
Yeah, and yeah, it would be, that would be an interesting story to understand why they did it, how they got together. I think this was during the Jim Crow laws in America as well when it occurred. So what they faced on the way, you know, and you know, how they managed to get to their goal at the end of it. I think that would be quite a nice story to understand, and that could inspire young Black women to sort of get on the bike and be, you know, and sort of defy the odds if you want. So that might be something that I might write, or someone else might want to decide to write.
Yeah, I think that's a great subject, and I think that thing of positioning them within this of social history is so important. Of what it really signified. Would you? I mean, I was wondering because I've often toyed with ideas of books set in the cycling deep past where there's not actually that much information. It's hard to get enough information to write a book about it. Would you be tempted to do a fictionalized version of their stories?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's been mentioned today. So if there isn't any sort of data on their sort of encounters or engagements with people, then that potentially could be written to some kind of fiction that could be made to a film as well.
No, I was just going to say, yeah, it could make a film. Yeah.
Paul.
Yeah, so this is like, what are you doing next sort of question, wasn't it?
Yeah. It's the 4th book.
Yeah, well, I'm not quite sure because I have this book, you know, that's coming out in April, which is finished, and I'm waiting for it. And I'm also like, I'm a bit anxious about this book because I feel like the books before were quite like tramlined, you know, like and when you do your first book, you're almost like, you just wet yourself in excitement that you've got a book, you know, and it doesn't really matter what it ends up like. You don't even know. You're like, it's a bit like if you, I don't know, an analogy I can think of is where like when you take your child home from the hospital and you just like, you know, you don't even know. It's just, you know, it's that. And then the second one was sort of much tighter but this one, I feel like I put my, like in the entirety of my being into it in a weird way. Like, I feel like this is, you know, there's elements that are very conventional, but there's also elements that are completely personal. And I don't know how that's going to happen. I know that on page 46 of this book, there's a picture that's going to really upset people in a weird way, or maybe make them laugh, or maybe make them cry. So I think I'm nervous about that sort of thing that's going to happen. So I don't know. Like, I genuinely don't know what I'm going to do next. And I do know that I don't want to do the same thing again. Like, I don't want to do, you know, I don't even want to write another cycling book for a while. I just don't know. I feel like maybe the other themes that I've tried to sort of touch on about time and happiness are going to be served better in a different form. So, you know, I'd be interested to see what people make of this new one.
Mm. I almost feel like you kind of need to go through therapy after you finish a book. It's quite a hard process, isn't it? That you go, you know, and it's like you put so much into it that it's quite hard to, you have to go through a period of like renormalizing, don't you? Back to the normal world.
Yeah, and you don't want to ever read it again. You know, it's like doing a PhD dissertation. You know,
Yeah.
Every time you do a book, it can be like that. And I think people who've done, you know, PhDs know that puts a lot of stress on things. And you know, and I know there's a question by Phil that says, how many of you write as your main job and source of income? You know, and it's like, if I took my wages from my writing, I think it would be the minimum wage for sort of child labour in a faraway
slavery.
I think that's what it'd work out at. It is not a sustainable income for me, which is why I teach children in my spare time. So yeah.
Isabel, did you want to?
Well, it's all a secret. I'm writing a proposal at the moment, but I've really got into history in recent years. I find it so. Actually, it's kind of related to one of the questions about one of your questions about how to keep things fresh, and I just find the history of cycling is so. This is so rich. There's so much to it. There's so many great stories there, and I find it really. I find it much more seductive than cycling now as a subject to write about. So I'm really interested in sort of cycling, its kind of situation in social history and kind of trying to understand a bit this sort of bigger picture of how people, you know, what it meant. You know, I think it really struck me with writing the book on the female cyclists was the significance of cycling for women, you know, in the 1890s and for the suffragette movement. It was this, you know, there's this quote. I didn't put it in the book because everyone quotes it. But Susan B. Anthony talking about, you know, I don't know anything that's done more for women to liberate them than the bicycle, or something along those lines. And it's this lovely. It just says everything. And I think. That's something that really interests me. How what cycling means on us. That's just like sounds like a really stupid answer, but I'm trying to.
We're all intrigued by what you're trying to avoid saying here. You're not going to tell us about the next book because obviously
it's a very macho. I'm going back to the men.
Excellent marketing ploy.
It's so going back to men with this next proposal, but in a not perhaps I won't say any more. It's kind of funny thing. So yeah.
Okay. So we're going to have to wrap things up there. There's still questions popping up in the chat, but we are going to have to draw a line, I'm afraid. I hope you've enjoyed this at least half as much as I have, because I've had a blast. And thank you all of you who've joined us this evening for your fantastic questions, your participation, and for giving up your time to come along. People have asked if our guests could send us the link to their publications, so I'll get those off people, and then I'll email everybody who's attended tonight with the list of publications, so you can get your Christmas orders in. I'll also be sending out a questionnaire to people as well at some point. If you don't want to answer it, that's absolutely fine. Just ignore the email. But finally, I'd just like to say thank you, and everybody might want to unmute for this, and I'll just see if Zoom can cope. Say thank you one last time to our four guests, to Isabel, Ian, Paul and Marlon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay. We've recorded tonight's session, as I mentioned earlier on. It will appear on the Institute for Modern Languages Research webpage and possibly YouTube later on. And again, I'll email the link out to people in case you know people who wanted to attend tonight but couldn't. To the agreement of our 4 guests, that is, of course. If anyone says no, then I will just have to bin everything. Okay. Anyway, thank you so much for coming along. Enjoy the rest of your evening. And and I see there's calls to me to do this again somehow. So I'll be in touch. Thank you.